Welcome back to Horrors Worldwide. Today I'm going to explain an American supernatural horror film called The Conjuring 2, released in 2016. Spoilers ahead! Watch out and stay safe. It's 1976, and Ed and Lorraine Warren are investigating the Amityville murders to present to the church. While sitting in the house, Lorraine closes her eyes to communicate with the spirits, and a boy's spirit appears to lead her to the basement. Here she is attacked by a demon-looking nun, and also sees a vision of Ed's death, terrifying her out of the vision. The next scene shows 4 siblings walking home from school, 3 girls and a boy. At home, their mother is stressed out because her estranged husband hasn't sent the money to care for their children for the past 3 months. Although she is very worried, it's clear that she loves her children and takes good care of them. Later that night, 2 sisters, Janet and Margaret, are playing with a Ouija board, asking if there is a spirit around and whether their father will ever come back, but there is no response. Later still, at 1:04 a.m., Janet wakes up to find herself on their living room floor and is confused about how she got there. Margaret is woken up by someone banging on her room's door, and just as she opens the door, Janet walks in, assuming that Janet was the one banging. Margaret falls back asleep. Back in the US, Ed and Lorraine are on a TV show with a doctor who is calling them out for being frauds, an accusation that infuriates Ed. The scene switches back to show the kids. Janet and her brother Billy are playing with a crank toy, and she is encouraging him to speak because he still cannot speak. Late at night, when Billy gets up to get a drink of water, he sees the swing outside the house moving on its own, as though someone is sitting on it, even though it is empty. In her room, Janet is sitting up and speaking to a shadowy corner of the room, telling someone to leave them alone and leave Billy alone. Margaret wakes up and soothes Janet, so she goes back to sleep. But as soon as Margaret lies down again, Janet is standing beside her bed, screaming that he should leave Billy alone. Annoyed, Margaret tells her that there's nobody there, but just then, an old man's voice comes from the corner of the room, saying, "This is my house." Margaret switches on the lamp, but there is nobody else in the room. Billy goes back to his room, but on the way he stumbles on a toy truck, which he then kicks into the play tent, and the truck is rolled back to his room. Billy then rolls the truck right back into the play tent. The truck then rolls right back at him, and then Billy hears a scream. This terrifies Billy so much that he runs to Peggy and wakes her up, telling her that there's someone in the tent. When Peggy goes to check the play tent, there's nobody there. And then she discovers Janet in the living room after having sleepwalked there. Janet is also running a high fever. The next day she is home from school and sees an old man's spirit who keeps changing the TV channel and screams at her to get out because it's his house. The next scene shows Ed and Lorraine again. Ed is painting a portrait of a character that he saw in his dream, and it turns out to be the nun Lorraine saw in her vision, and this stresses her out. She says she wants to take a break from spiritual cases for a while. That night, Janet ties herself to her bed so she won't sleepwalk again, but someone pushes her out of the bed while she's sleeping. Hearing a bang on the door, she goes outside but runs in again when she sees the armchair in the living room rocking by itself. She tries to hide under the bed, but someone bites her, and then both hers and Margaret's beds start shaking. Frightened, they run to Peggy, and when she comes into their rooms and finds the Ouija board, she gets extremely angry. However, before she can react further, the dresser is suddenly pushed in front of the door by an invisible force. The whole frightened family runs to the neighbors where they go over what happened to them, and the neighbors advise them to call the police. But when the police members hear noises in the wall and an armchair moves in front of them by itself, they tell Peggy that this is a case for the church. Switching back to Lorraine, we see that she has another vision of the nun that she saw before, and when she screams at the nun asking her what she wants, she sees the same vision of Ed dying. During her vision, she is seen violently ripping the pages of a Bible. The next day, Peggy is approached by Kent Allen, who is with Wide Angle, a television news program. He mentions the disturbance and that the constable's incident report raised some eyebrows, implying they televised an interview. Peggy, reluctant, tells Kent that she doesn't want her business on TV, but Kent rebuttals by saying getting her story out would be her best chance of finding help. We then cut to Kent reporting the story. This is followed by a montage of eyewitnesses telling their stories pertaining to the incident. We are then introduced to Morris Gross, an engineering consultant, and Anita Gregory, a parapsychologist and skeptic who is not convinced by the Hodgson story. We then cut to Kent's interview with Janet. He asks how it feels being in a haunted house. Peggy mentions this is all very new and that it wasn't long ago that they were living a normal life. Janet mentions the spirit has been getting worse since Morris started talking to it. Kent opens the invitation for the spirit to communicate. Janet's voice suddenly changes to that of an old man who tells everyone that his name is Bill Wilkins, that he went blind and died of a brain hemorrhage on the armchair in the corner. He adds that he is enjoying the suffering of the Hodgson family. That night, the Hodgson family is sleeping in the neighbor's house when we see Janet completely possessed by the Crooked Man. This is the same figure drawn on the toy Billy and Janet were playing with at the beginning of the film. The Crooked Man has possessed the old man who has been taunting Janet and now, through her, wants to kill her neighbor's kids. After wreaking havoc, Janet collapses. After these incidents, a priest visits Ed and Lorraine at their house and plays a recording of Janet's voice. They both think that it is the voice of an old man, but he tells them that it is actually the voice of an 11-year-old girl and that she needs their help. Lorraine is initially reluctant to go and tells Ed about the dream she's been having about him dying, but Ed suggests that maybe God has been giving her a sign and proceeds to convince her to help the family. In England, Peggy shows Ed Janet's room, which she has covered in crosses to weaken the demon, and she also locks it with a chain and padlock. Outside, Lorraine offers comfort to Janet by sharing a memory of how she saw an angel. This breaks the ice and Janet asks how she found someone to trust. Lorraine then reveals that she married the only one who believed her. Janet then expresses that she can't sleep and how everyone's afraid of her. As the moment continues, Lorraine asks how the spirit affects Janet, and the scene ends with Janet agreeing that the spirit says things only she can hear, and that Bill said he wants to hurt Lorraine. This is one of my favorite scenes in the movie. Madison Wolfe was an amazing child actor, and this scene is a huge highlight in my book. The Warrens then hold a seance where they communicate with Bill Wilkins. Before it starts, they have Janet fill her mouth with water to prevent her from speaking. The seance starts and Bill taunts Ed for a brief moment. Ed then asks questions, and when Bill doesn't comply, he shows Bill a cross. Bill begins to scream and mutter words that don't make sense in sequence. The seance ends and Janet spits the water out, proving she was not the one speaking. Later in their room, Lorraine tells Ed that she didn't feel any spiritual presence when they were doing the seance. Back at the Hodgson's house, Janet wakes up to find herself stuck to the ceiling and the old man demon seated on the armchair again. He pushes Janet through the ceiling into her old bedroom where all the crosses are turned upside down. Her shrieking wakes up Peggy, and when she rushes to the room, she can see the old man demon. Ed and Lorraine come running and manage to save Janet, who is suffocating in a big cloth. The next day, Ed is helping Peggy repair her washing machine in the basement when they are both attacked by the old demon. Upstairs, the kids are also attacked by a demon, and initially Johnny tries to fight it, but it overwhelms all the children, and Janet is seen possessed again. The adults come running upstairs to find things being flung all over the kitchen, and when they manage to break in, they find the children terrified, and Janet missing. After a lot of searching, they find her hiding in a cabinet, looking completely possessed. That night, Anita Gregory shows up after the incident, revealing she filmed proof of Janet faking the entire event. Anita, the paranormal investigators, and the Warrens all address the video to Peggy, and Anita accuses her of putting Janet up to everything in the attempt to get housing and out of poverty. Ed Warren adds that if the church saw the footage, that would be the end of their contributions. Helpless Peggy, in anger and disbelief, kicks everyone out. Morris Gross tries convincing the Warrens to continue helping the Hodgsons, but Lorraine says she hasn't sensed any spirit even since her arrival. Ed also iterates that the video footage is the only concrete evidence they have, and the church would send them right back to America anyway. Morris guilts the Warrens for abandoning Janet by quoting Ed, saying to help sometimes takes a leap of faith, and to believe when no one else will. Later, the kids ask Janet if she was really the one who ransacked everything. This leads to the confession that Bill Wilkins threatened to kill all of them if she didn't make the Warrens leave. After Ed drops the tapes that he recorded during the event, he has an epiphany and proceeds to try and connect the garbled messages he heard from Bill Wilkins. They play the recordings in a certain sequence, which forms a complete message in which the old man is saying, "Help, it won't let me go." Just then, Lorraine has a vision in which she sees Bill Wilkins in the armchair, breathing through a respirator. He tells her that he had just come to see his family, but that she had stopped him from leaving, and that she is using both him and the Crooked Man as pawns. Lorraine sees the demonic nun behind the old man, and realizes that the nun is behind everything. They rush back to the house. Meanwhile, at the house, Janet is completely possessed by the nun, and she is attacking the rest of the family. Peggy manages to get the other children out, but the door locks itself when she tries to run in and get Janet. Just then, Ed and Lorraine arrive at the house. Ed manages to get in through the basement, but when Lorraine tries to follow, the door locks itself. Lorraine desperately cries out to Ed, begging him not to go because she's afraid of losing him. She mentions her visions of his death. Ed responds admitting he made a promise to her, but that he has to help Janet. He bids Lorraine goodbye, ready to sacrifice himself to save the little girl. He goes off and Lorraine cries out. He breaks through the basement floor, but just then a water pipe bursts, injuring his eyes and making his vision blurry. He stumbles toward the living room due to the sound of music, and when he goes inside, we see long white fingers curling over the edge of the door. Ed hears Janet's voice from upstairs and also the voice of the demon, and he takes off his crucifix and holds it out in an attempt to weaken the demon. Outside, Lorraine pulls out the Bible that she had ripped with a pen when she had the vision of the demonic nun, and realizes that the demon had told her its name and that speaking the name will weaken it. Just then, lightning falls on a tree outside of the house, and the tree is blasted into the shape of the wood which she had envisioned killing Ed. Inside, Ed is attacked by the Crooked Man, but manages to save himself. He then sees Janet about to jump out of a shattered window, and he jumps forward to save her. He is hanging half out of the window with Janet when Lorraine runs in to help him, but she is thrown back by the demon nun. She screams out the demon's name, Valak, and condemns it back to hell. The nun collapses and vanishes, and Lorraine runs forward and pulls in both Ed and Janet. The next scene takes place the following morning. The Hodgsons and the Warrens are recuperating from the previous night's events. Ed and Lorraine have a tender moment, thanking each other and reflecting on how fate brought them there. Janet approaches and hugs Ed, thanking the Warrens for their help. Ed gifts Janet his cross necklace, saying it protected him. He tells her to pass it along to someone who will need it in the future. Janet says she's lucky because even though Lorraine told her that only one person can change everything, she had two. The Warrens smile, and the scene ends on a warm note. The camera then pans off to a disturbing title sequence that reveals in 2003, Peggy Hodgson quietly passed away in the same exact spot Bill Wilkins did. The film ends with another tender moment between the Warrens, in which they slow dance to Elvis Presley's Can't Help Falling in Love. So that was our recap of The Conjuring 2, one of my favorite horror movies of all time. If you haven't seen them, I would actually recommend giving this and the first one a watch. Are you a fan of the Conjuring series? Let us know in the comments. And before you go, don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for future horror film recaps.